we study Locke's ethics, we typically go to the Second Treatise of Government, which is fine. It's a good book. It's a good presentation of Locke's ethics. But there's more to Locke's ethics than this. And it might be better to go to the letter concerning toleration for the big picture. Or better yet, to go to both texts. The letter concerning toleration is a defense of what we now call disestablishment, or separation of church and state. It's a defense of the idea that the government does not prefer a particular church or a particular religious community. So the text might best be approached systematically from the top down, or at least that's one fitting way to describe it. Anyway, let's try that. The text posits that there are two components, two halves of the happy life. The pursuit of the good life involves two distinct tracks. There's the pursuit of temporal goods and the pursuit of eternal goods, or the pursuit of worldly goods and the pursuit of spiritual goods. Now, worldly goods are things like physical life and health and physical comforts, food, water, shelter, along with things less necessary, but things we seem to want just the same. Television, internet, and all the things, all the stuff that we own, all the things we buy, all the things you pay for at Walmart. These are temporal and worldly goods. And spiritual goods, well, that's different. The spiritual goods are primarily, if not exclusively, God's favor. Spiritual good means, so to speak, being on God's good side. Winning God's approval. That's a spiritual good. And from this distinction among things spiritual that are goods that we pursue and things temporal which are goods that we pursue, Locke makes a distinction of two different communities of which we might be a part. There's the political community and the religious community. The political community exists to pursue these temporal goods. The religious community exists to pursue the spiritual goods. The temporal goods are pursued by means of certain classical liberal principles, which he articulates more fully in the Second Treatise of Government. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness through property. These are Lockean principles that help to pursue our temporal goods. This is what government exists to protect. It exists to protect property rights, to protect the right to life, and so on. That's the political philosophy. The letter concerning toleration is giving us the big picture it fits into. As for the spiritual goods, well, they're pursued by a religious community, and the spiritual good we really want is God's favor. And a religious community is a voluntary, communal, voluntary coming together into a community to pursue this spiritual good in the way we think best. Now, Locke makes an argument that toleration is important. Here, toleration means not necessarily what we think of as tolerance in the world today. Toleration means just what I said before, disestablishment, separation of church and state. Toleration means the government doesn't tell you which religion is best. The government does not tell you how to win God's favor. The government does not tell you how to get into heaven. And Locke gives an argument that toleration is best, or that here's a good way of putting it, that the church must not take up the tools of the government in order to achieve spiritual goods. The argument, or at least the main argument, is primarily this. The spiritual good we really want is God's favor. What God honors is faith and inward sincerity. God honors our genuine belief, our genuine commitment. And this is something, this genuine commitment that is the necessary way of achieving spiritual good. This commitment cannot be achieved by temporal means. We have spiritual ends and temporal ends. Spiritual goods, temporal goods, spiritual ends of getting these goods, temporal ends of getting these goods, and spiritual and temporal communities that are aiming at them, and spiritual and temporal means of achieving them. And the means that are available to the church to achieve these spiritual goods involve logic, persuasion, rhetoric, but it does not involve violence, which is the essential tool of the state. The government, the state, the political community wields the power of the sword. And the power of the sword is not an appropriate means of achieving spiritual goods. It's a means that does not fit its end. The end is God's favor, but since God favors faith only and inward sincerity, I'm quoting from Locke there, faith only and inward sincerity, since that's what God favors, and since we are not persuaded to really believe in a certain theology just because someone's pointing a gun at our heads or a sword at our necks or threatening to burn us at the stake for our bad theology, since that's not what convinces us, these are not appropriate tools for the church to use to achieve its ends. Persuasion only, no force. Force is not belonging to, not a proper tool for the church. Now, there are limitations to the separation of church and state that Locke goes over. When a theology interferes, or when, let's not say a theology, when a religious perspective, when a theory on a theological matter interferes with the pursuit of temporal goods, the government has the right, indeed the obligation, to restrict it. Separation of church and state is not absolute and total. There are exceptions. One of the exceptions, of course, would be something fairly obvious, like religious violence. Consider the ancient cult of Molech, the ancient Canaanite religion of Molech. This was literally a child-sacrificing religion. A child-sacrificing religion is interfering with the right to life of the people in the political community. So, of course, the government does have the business of restricting this religious practice. And Locke actually says atheists are to be censored. We in our day might read this and think, oh, he's contradicting himself. He wants religious liberty, and then he says, censor atheists. And we may make of that what we will. Some clever, skeptical readers of Locke say that this is the proof that he's lying. He probably doesn't believe anything he says. He has political reasons for keeping his real views secret. Maybe he's some kind of an atheist himself, and the whole thing is something of a farce. That's one particular way of reading the philosophers, of thinking that political philosophers are frequently liars. Straussians in political science sometimes go this way when they read the philosophers. An alternative approach would be Locke's just contradicting himself. He believes in religious liberty, but he doesn't fully follow through on that. And he's perhaps a victim of his time. He didn't understand in his cultural context that atheism should also be protected by this separation of church and state. If we want to read Locke and understand him properly, we need to pay careful attention to why he would say this. What he says in this particular text is something to this effect. He says, oaths have no hold upon an atheist. This might mean one of two things that come to my mind. It might mean simply that if you don't believe in God, you have less motive to be good. And so you are not sufficiently motivated to keep your promises, and, well, you make a bad citizen. And so atheists who spread disbelief in God can be censored as a way of protecting society from the pernicious influence of disbelief in God, which fosters a resistance to God as a motive for being good and being a good citizen, something like that. There is more. In Locke's Second Treatise of Government, you find that his theory of human rights relies on God. Humans have value because of God's estimation of the importance of humans. God values humans, and that's why we have value, and that's why we have human rights. Human rights ultimately depend on God. So don't think that the separation of church and state in Locke means that that there's no such thing as a religious principle that's relevant to political theory. No, actually, his political theory has as its very foundation a religious principle, that God exists. And further, the principle that God values us. Using language from the American founding, we derive our human rights from nature and from nature's God. This is a Lockean way of talking. The Declaration of Independence is a very Lockean document. So, the separation of church and state means more that the church does not take up the power of the state in order to spread its theology, in order to enforce good theology. The church has no business wielding the sword. It means the government does not tell you how to get to heaven. But it does not mean that there's no such thing as a theological principle that has any business influencing government. That is very much the case. The existence of God is a principle that influences politics. It is the very foundation of human rights, which is the reason we have government in the first place, to protect our human rights. So this may be another reason that Locke says atheists are to be censored in the letter concerning toleration.